and welcome to CNN, the casual news network where we don't really report on the news. I'm Brian Fantana. Breaking news regarding aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but first, let's check the weather. It seems we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Let's talk about that breaking news. Here's Veronica Corningstone with some cool information.
Thanks, Brian. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is a model that most economists use to explain short-run fluctuations in economic activity around its long-run trend. Back to you, Brian.
Thanks, Veronica. Let's take a gander at one of the images our viewers sent in. As we know, economists use this model to determine economic fluctuations. On the vertical axis is the overall level of prices. On the horizontal axis is the economy's total output of goods and services. Output and price levels adjust to the point at which the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves intersect.
The aggregate demand curve is a curve that shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, the government, and customers abroad want to buy at each price level.
More breaking news. Prices in lawnmowers have dropped from $8 to $5, causing an increase of quantity of goods and services demanded from 8 to 12 households and firms. As you can see, a fall in the price from level P1 to P2 increases the quantity of goods and services demanded from Y1 to Y2. You may be asking yourself, why does the demand curve slope downwards? Let's send it over to Veronica Corningstone on a special report as to why.
Veronica Corningstone here. I'm here with Nicole and Jessica. They just participated in the wealth effect. Yesterday, Nicole bought one iPhone from Jessica at Apple for $1. Today, however, the price level of iPhones decreased, allowing Nicole to buy 3 iPhones for that same $1. This is part of the idea that the real value of $1 is not a fixed amount. Here, Nicole became richer from the decrease in price. In addition to the wealth effect, there's the interest rate effect and the exchange rate effect. The interest rate effect is when a lower price level reduces the interest rate, which stimulates spending on investment. The exchange rate effect is when a lower price level causes the real exchange rate to depreciate, which stimulates spending on net exports.
Thank you, Veronica, for letting us know why the aggregate demand slopes downward. Now let's take a look at why it shifts.
This is Veronica Corningstone. This is how the aggregate demand curve shifts. Regarding changes in consumption, the tax for lawnmowers has fallen, causing the customers to spend more. That shifts the aggregate demand to the right. However, if the tax for lawnmowers had risen, the aggregate demand curve would have shifted to the left. Regarding changes in investment, if a firm has optimism for the future, gaining money from an investment, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right because the consumers want more money. However, if they are pessimistic, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left because the consumers want to be more protective of their money. When it comes to changes in government purchases, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right if they purchased more streetlights, and shift to the left if they cut funding to streetlights. Finally, if there is a boom overseas for a product, such as American flags, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. But if no other country wants American flags, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Back to Brian Fantana.
And now some news on aggregate supply.
Aggregate supply curve is a curve that shows the quantity of goods and services that firms choose to produce and sell at each price level.
As the graph shows, for long-run aggregate supply, a change in price level does not affect the quantity of goods and services supplied.
The long-run aggregate supply curve might shift for several reasons. If, for instance, there was a rise in immigrants to the U.S. from Russia, the U.S. would have a larger amount of potential workers from the change in labor, shifting the aggregate supply to the right. And if people immigrated out of the U.S., then the aggregate supply would shift to the left. Changes in capital cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right if productivity increases, and shifts to the left if the nation's productivity decreases. If there's an increase in the abundance in natural resources, such as finding a new mineral deposit, the aggregate supply would shift to the right. However, if the supply is depleted, such as there being less gold found, the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. Technological knowledge shifts the curve to the right when newer technology helps advance productivity. For the short-run aggregate supply curve, all of the same shifts may occur that were possible in the long run, using a slightly upward slanted aggregate supply curve now. However, there is one additional way to shift the curve. If the expected price level decreases, the aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, and the curve would shift to the left if the expected price level increases.
Let's take it over to Veronica to find out why the aggregate supply curve slopes upward.
Thanks, Brian. There are three factors as to why the aggregate supply curve is slanted upward. The first is the sticky wage theory, and it states that a suddenly low wage raises the real wage, leading to a smaller production of goods. The sticky price theory is the idea that a suddenly low price for a product would give some firms prices higher than they desire, which would depress their sales. For instance, the price of flour could have dropped, making it cheaper for bakers to bake bread. However, they would still be charging a large amount for bread than customers realize that they can make home for cheaper. Finally, the misperceptions theory is the idea that a suddenly low price could temporarily make suppliers think their output price can be changed, when in reality it is just a market fluke. Back to you, Ryan.
Alternatively, a simple formula can be used to show the upward sloping curve. The quantity of output supplied equals the natural rate of output plus how much output responds to unexpected changes at that price level times the actual price level minus the expected price level. Putting both the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graphs together, there is a long-run equilibrium point where the two lines intersect, similar to the equilibrium in regular supply and demand. This point shows the expected price level will have adjusted itself to equal the actual price level the economy is currently at. Veronica Corningstone, tell these fine people how they can analyze macroeconomic fluctuations in aggregate supply and aggregate demand.
Analyze macroeconomic functions with aggregate supply and demand by first deciding whether the event shifts the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve, or even both. Second, deciding which direction the curve shifts. These first two steps are very similar to how to analyze a regular supply and demand graph. Third, use the diagram of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to determine the impact on the output and the price level in the short run, not the long run. Lastly, use the diagram to analyze how the economy moves from its new short-run equilibrium to its long-run equilibrium. Let's look at an example. If there is a decrease in demand for lawnmowers, output would fall, shifting to the left in the short run. However, the aggregate supply shifts to the right over time in the short run, returning to the output of lawnmowers to its natural rate. All in the short run, shifts in aggregate demand causes fluctuations in the economy's output of goods and services. In the long run, shifts in aggregate demand affect the overall price level, but do not affect output. Back to you, Brian.
Fascinating. Fluctuations seen in the economy are seen as irregular and unpredictable, and in most cases, most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. Also, as output falls, unemployment rises. Before we leave you today, here's a little history. Aggregate demand was witnessed in the early 1930s in the Great Depression. To be exact, a depression is a part of the business cycle and a severe recession. A recession is a period of declining real incomes and rising unemployment. Unemployment rose to 3%, and the Great Depression can be linked to the decline in money supply over the nation at the time, leaving many extremely poor. On the contrary, stagflation, or a period of falling output and rising prices, was seen in the oil industry around the 1970s. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, was formed and reduced their production in order to raise prices of crude oil. This couldn't be a better example of aggregate supply at work. Thanks for joining us tonight at CNN. You stay classy, ECO225.